The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of explosions echoed through the valley. Days had turned into weeks, and every sunrise brought more bad news. The soldiers stationed on the front lines could feel it in their bones. Their side was losing. Supplies were running out. Communication lines had gone silent, and even the bravest among them had started to lose faith. The battlefield that once held strong defenses was now nothing more than broken walls, burned-out vehicles, and muddy trenches filled with exhausted men and women trying to survive another day. They had been fighting for so long that no one remembered what silence sounded like. Every few minutes, the ground would tremble from distant blasts. The radio was filled with half-broken messages, pleas for backup, cries for medical help, or static that reminded them no one was coming. The commanding officers tried to stay calm, but it was clear that things were falling apart. Maps were covered in red lines showing lost positions, and each passing hour brought the enemy closer. The soldiers were tired beyond words. Some had not eaten a proper meal in days. Others hadn't slept in almost 2 nights. The rain poured endlessly, mixing with dirt to create thick mud that clung to their boots. They sat quietly inside their shelters, cleaning their weapons not because they believed in victory, but because they didn't know what else to do. In nearby villages, people watched from a distance as the skies glowed orange every night. The sound of shelling had become as common as thunder. Mothers tried to calm their children, pretending everything would be fine even though their eyes told another story. Every conversation started the same way. "Did you hear? The front line has fallen." They whispered about soldiers retreating, about how the enemy was stronger, faster, and had more weapons. The words "it's over" passed from one mouth to another like a quiet curse, but there was still one rumor that refused to die. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a special unit was on its way. No one knew their real name, but soldiers called them the Indomitable. Some said they were survivors from earlier battles. Others claimed they were volunteers who refused to accept defeat. Whatever the truth was, people believed they were different, not because of better weapons, but because of their will to fight when everyone else had given up. Back at the camp, a young soldier sat staring at the muddy horizon. His uniform was torn, his hands covered in blisters. He looked around at his fellow soldiers, and for the first time he saw something he had never noticed before. Silence. The jokes, the nervous laughter, the shared stories that used to keep them sane had vanished. The war had taken away not just their strength, but also their spirit. Still, no one dared to speak of surrender. Every soldier there had someone waiting back home, a mother, a friend, a family they wanted to see again. Even when hope was slipping away, that single thought kept them holding their rifles a little tighter. As the day ended, dark clouds rolled in, and heavy rain began to fall once again. The commander stood outside, his boots sinking into the mud. He looked toward the road that disappeared into the distance. He knew what everyone else was thinking, that the next attack might be their last. Yet deep inside, there was still a faint spark of hope that refused to die. Maybe the rumors about the Indomitable were true. Maybe someone was still coming. That night, no one slept. The rain beat against metal helmets and empty fuel drums. The soldiers took turns on watch, staring into the darkness, listening for the faintest sign of movement. Every rustle of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like an advancing enemy. Fear was constant, but it had become a familiar companion, something they had learned to live with. As midnight passed, one of the scouts returned, soaked from head to toe. He stumbled into the commander's tent, breathless. "There's movement on the ridge," he said. Could be them. For a moment, no one spoke. The commander's eyes narrowed. "You're sure?" The scout nodded. "They're flying our flag." That was the first time in weeks anyone had smiled. The word spread fast through the camp, whisper to whisper, tent to tent. "They're here." The Indomitable had arrived. When the first light of dawn touched the valley, a small convoy appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a massive army or a heavily armed division. It was just a group of tired soldiers walking through the mud with steady steps. They looked ordinary at first glance. Mud on their uniforms, bags slung over their shoulders. But there was something different about the way they moved. Their faces were calm, their eyes sharp, and their formation tight. The defenders watched silently as they entered the camp. No grand speeches were made, no loud orders shouted. The leader of the new group simply nodded to the commander, then walked straight to the damaged defense line. Without a word, they began repairing fortifications, setting up sandbags, checking weapons, and helping the wounded. It was as if they had no time for introductions. Their presence alone seemed to change the air around them. The other soldiers, still weak from days of fighting, started helping too. Slowly, the camp that had been drowning in despair began to move again. There was no celebration, no sudden burst of joy, just quiet determination spreading from one person to another. One of the older soldiers from the Indomitable unit worked side by side with the younger ones. He spoke softly while tightening a damaged machine gun mount. "You can't control the sky or the enemy's numbers," he said, "but you can control what you do right now. That's how we survive." His words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. By noon, the camp looked alive again. Medical tents were reorganized, trenches reinforced, and broken equipment fixed as best as possible. The rain stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds, lighting up the muddy field like a promise that the worst might finally be over. That evening, as they shared their first proper meal in days, some canned food and boiled water, stories started to flow again. The soldiers who had nearly lost hope began to speak of their homes, their families, and what they would do once the war ended. Laughter, quiet but real, began to echo around the fire. For the first time in a long while, they didn't talk about death. They talked about tomorrow. When darkness fell, everyone could feel that something had shifted. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled them. It was replaced by a strange calm, the kind that comes when people decide to stand together no matter the cost. Far in the distance, enemy flares lit up the night sky, reminding them that another attack was coming soon. The Indomitable soldiers didn't flinch. They looked at those lights and then at each other, understanding without speaking that the next battle would decide everything. As the wind blew through the valley, carrying the smell of smoke and wet earth, the commander stood near the front line, watching his men prepare. He no longer felt that crushing sense of helplessness. He knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Behind him, a soldier from the Indomitable unit adjusted his helmet and said quietly, "They think we're finished. Let's prove them wrong." Those simple words spread like wildfire through the camp. Soldiers repeated them under their breath as they cleaned their weapons, loaded ammunition, and checked their positions. They didn't have fancy speeches or powerful machines, but they had something the enemy didn't: the will to keep going, no matter what came next. That night, under the flickering light of campfires, the defenders looked out at the dark horizon and waited. The fear was still there, but it had turned into something else: determination. Defeat might have seemed unavoidable, but now, with the Indomitable standing beside them, no one was ready to give up. The next morning arrived quietly, with a pale sun peeking through the clouds. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and gunpowder. The camp, once filled with tired faces and broken spirits, now showed faint signs of movement. People were walking with purpose again. You could hear the sound of shovels digging, tools clanging, and distant voices giving directions. Something had changed overnight. The group that had arrived, the Indomitable soldiers, had no time for introductions or speeches. They simply got to work. They repaired broken communication lines, moved the wounded to safer tents, and reinforced every weak spot along the defense. Watching them was like watching people who had already seen the worst and refused to be afraid anymore. One of them moved through the camp, checking on everyone. He didn't speak much, but his presence alone made others stand taller. He walked with calm confidence, the kind that came from experience rather than pride. Wherever he went, soldiers followed his example. If he lifted a sandbag, they lifted too. If he cleaned a rifle, they checked their own weapons right after. There was no shouting, no drama, no complaints. It was quiet teamwork. Everyone seemed to understand what had to be done without being told. By noon, the camp looked different. Trenches had been deepened, barriers were in place, and the lookout towers had been fixed. A few soldiers even managed to reconnect a damaged radio, and for the first time in days, a clear signal came through. The sound of a friendly voice on the other end brought cheers from the tired crew. The outside world hadn't forgotten them after all. Still, danger was not far away. Scouts returning from the hills reported movement. Enemy forces were gathering again. They weren't sure when the next attack would come, but everyone knew it could happen at any moment. Even with that news, fear didn't control them anymore. The Indomitable unit had brought something stronger than weapons: belief. Their calm, disciplined way of working showed everyone that defeat wasn't written in stone. It could be changed with courage and unity. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the commander gathered everyone for a short talk. His voice was tired but firm. "We've been through worse," he said. "If they come again, we stand together. No one fights alone." The soldiers nodded. No one clapped or shouted. They just looked at each other, silently agreeing. They all understood what was coming, and somehow that made them stronger. When night fell, the stars came out over the battlefield, tiny sparks of light in a sky that had seen too much darkness. Around small fires, soldiers sat in groups talking softly. Some shared stories about home, about quiet mornings, laughter, and small memories they missed. Others cleaned their rifles or wrote short letters they might never send. It wasn't sadness that filled the air anymore. It was acceptance, a calm readiness for whatever was next. A young soldier stared at the flames, his face reflecting the light. "Do you think we can really turn this around?" he asked softly. One of the Indomitable soldiers sitting beside him smiled faintly and replied, "It doesn't matter what they think we can do. It matters what we decide to do." The answer wasn't loud, but it carried weight. That single sentence spread quietly through the camp. It became a small spark of strength that everyone seemed to hold on to. The next morning came faster than anyone expected. The scouts spotted distant movement again, shadows across the hills, slow but steady. It meant one thing. The enemy was preparing for a major assault. The camp went into alert. No panic, no running, just quick, steady preparation. The Indomitable unit led the work. They double-checked every line of defense, distributed ammunition, and reminded everyone to stay calm. "We don't fight with fear," one of them said, handing out rifles. "We fight with focus." The commander stood at the front, watching the sun rise over the valley. His uniform was stained, his face lined with exhaustion, yet his eyes held something new: fire. He knew they might be outnumbered, but he also knew that numbers alone didn't decide everything. Throughout the day, the camp buzzed with quiet determination. Every soldier had a task. Some guarded the perimeter, others prepared supplies or reinforced the walls. Even those who were injured helped in small ways, tying bandages or carrying water. No one sat idle. When evening came, the sky turned red as if the horizon itself was burning. The soldiers gathered again for a meal. Nothing fancy, just a few bites of cold food. The air felt heavy, but there was no fear now. The Indomitable had managed to change the atmosphere completely. Later that night, the first signs of the enemy appeared again. Faint lights in the distance, small movements across the field. The lookouts called out positions, and everyone prepared silently. The Indomitable soldiers stood ready, faces calm, weapons steady. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The commander gave a final order. "No one fires unless we see them clearly. Hold your ground." The night dragged on slowly. Hours passed without a sound. The only noise came from the wind brushing through the trees and the quiet breathing of soldiers waiting for what they knew was coming. Then, sometime after midnight, a sound broke the silence. A single distant explosion, followed by flashes of light. The enemy had started testing their defenses again. Small bursts at first, then more. The soldiers held their positions, waiting for the right moment. Inside the camp, even the wounded who couldn't fight sat upright, listening. Every explosion felt like a heartbeat. Every flash a reminder that the line between survival and defeat was paper-thin. Still, the Indomitable soldiers didn't flinch. They moved through the trenches, checking positions, giving quiet encouragement. One of them stopped beside a trembling young fighter, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said softly, "We're not out of this yet. Stay steady." It was strange. No one shouted commands, no one panicked. It was like watching a storm approach while knowing exactly what to do when it hit. Hours passed, and before dawn, the attack stopped again. Silence returned. The soldiers waited for another wave, but it didn't come. When morning light finally broke, they realized the enemy had pulled back for now, likely regrouping for something bigger. The relief that swept through the camp was quiet but real. Some soldiers smiled. Others simply exhaled deeply. They knew the next day would bring another test, maybe worse than before. Yet for now, they had survived. After sunrise, the commander walked through the trenches. He saw faces that had once been filled with despair now looking alert, alive. He paused near a small group who were fixing a machine gun mount. "You all did well last night," he said. One of them replied, "We're not done yet." The commander nodded slowly. "No," he said. "We're just getting started." That morning, as the soldiers prepared again, a sense of unity hung in the air. The Indomitable had become more than just a group of fighters. They had become the heart of the defense. Their calm strength reminded everyone that even in the darkest hour, humans could rise again. The enemy might have had more numbers, more power, and better weapons. But what stood against them now wasn't just an army. It was a wall of determination built from pain, courage, and belief. As the sun climbed higher, the commander looked across the valley and whispered to himself, "They think we're finished. Let's show them we're still here." Behind him, the Indomitable soldiers checked their rifles one last time, their faces steady, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The battle wasn't over. It was only beginning, and deep inside every person in that camp, tired, bruised, and hungry, felt something rise again. It wasn't anger or fear. It was pride. The quiet, unshakable kind that only comes when people choose to stand their ground, no matter what happens next. They didn't know how the next fight would end. They didn't know if help would ever come. But for the first time in a long while, they didn't feel hopeless. They were ready. The night before the big attack was strangely quiet. The wind had stopped, the sky was clear, and the stars looked brighter than usual. For the first time in many days, the air didn't smell like smoke. Yet deep down, everyone in the camp knew that silence like this wasn't peace, it was a warning. It was the kind of stillness that always came before something terrible. The soldiers moved carefully through the trenches, checking their positions. They spoke in low voices, trying not to disturb the stillness around them. Each of them knew what was coming. Scouts had already reported enemy movement across the ridge. Hundreds, maybe thousands, were gathering. The next attack wouldn't be a test. It would be the real thing, the one meant to break them completely. Inside the command tent, the flicker of a lantern lit up tired faces. The commander leaned over a map that was more dirt and creases than paper. He traced his finger along the thin defensive line, then sighed quietly. "They'll hit us here first," he said, pointing to the weak section near the old bridge. "If they get through that, they'll reach the camp within an hour." Around him, a few officers nodded, their eyes heavy but focused. They didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue about. The plan was simple: hold the line no matter what. Outside, the Indomitable soldiers were already preparing. They reinforced barricades, placed warning flares, and double-checked the wounded were safe in shelters. None of them complained, even though their bodies were just as tired as everyone else's. They worked like people who had made peace with the worst but refused to stop fighting. One of them walked through the camp carrying extra water and rations, leaving them where others could find them easily. When a younger soldier offered to help, he smiled faintly and said, "Save your strength for the morning. You'll need it." The words weren't meant to comfort, but they did. There was something steady about the way he said them, something that made others feel braver. As the hours passed, small fires flickered across the camp. Groups of soldiers sat together, talking quietly. They didn't talk about strategy anymore. They talked about small things, about food they missed, people they loved, places they hoped to see again. Laughter appeared here and there, short but genuine. Even in the middle of fear, human warmth still found a way to exist. A young soldier pulled out a small battered notebook and started writing. When someone asked what he was doing, he said, "If we make it through tomorrow, I want to remember what it felt like tonight." No one replied, but everyone understood what he meant. Meanwhile, the commander walked along the front lines, stopping to speak to the sentries. "Stay alert," he told them quietly. "But don't let fear eat you alive." His voice carried calm authority, though his own heart was racing. Far away, beyond the hills, faint lights appeared. The enemy was moving into position. Some of the soldiers saw them and stiffened, but the Indomitable didn't react. One of them whispered, "Let them come. We'll be ready." Around midnight, fog began to roll in, covering the valley in a pale gray blanket. Visibility dropped. The air grew cold, heavy, and still. Every sound felt sharper. The crunch of boots, the click of metal, the soft rustle of gear being checked one last time. In one of the trenches, two soldiers sat side by side, their rifles resting against the dirt wall. One of them stared out into the fog and said softly, "Do you think anyone will remember us if we don't make it?" The other smiled faintly. "Someone always remembers. Maybe not the names, but the fight." It was quiet after that. Just the slow rhythm of breathing, the heartbeat of anticipation. Then, sometime before dawn, the ground trembled. A distant rumble echoed through the fog. It started faint, like thunder far away, but grew louder every second. The sound of engines, tanks, heavy vehicles. The attack was coming. The commander stepped out of his tent, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Positions. He called out, and the camp moved instantly. Everyone knew their role. The Indomitable soldiers took the front, while others filled in the defense lines. The fog thickened, making it hard to see more than a few meters ahead. The silence broke again, this time with sharp cracks of gunfire from the hills. The enemy had started their push. Tracer rounds lit up the sky, slicing through the mist like fireflies of death. Still, the defenders held their fire. They waited until the enemy came close enough to see clearly. The Indomitable stood firm, unmoving, their weapons steady. The commander's voice came through the radio. "Hold! Hold! Now!" A wave of sound exploded across the valley as hundreds of rifles opened fire. The quiet night turned into chaos. The ground shook, smoke filled the air, and the sky flashed with bursts of light. The attack had begun. The first few minutes felt endless. The enemy came in waves, shouting and firing blindly into the fog. The defenders used every bit of training they had. The Indomitable moved from spot to spot, reinforcing weak points, calling out directions, helping anyone who faltered. One soldier, nearly out of ammunition, looked over at the Indomitable leader. "We can't hold much longer," he shouted. The reply came calm and firm. "Then we'll hold a little longer." Those words became something like a commandment. Every time someone felt like giving up, they repeated it, "A little longer." And somehow that little bit of extra strength made all the difference. Hours passed like minutes. The fog began to lift, revealing the full scale of destruction. Smoke covered everything. The ground was torn apart, the trees were splintered, and the noise was deafening. Yet through it all, the defenders stood. When the sun finally rose, the battlefield looked like something from another world. The enemy had pulled back for now, leaving behind broken vehicles and silence once more. The soldiers, still standing at their posts, could hardly believe it. They had survived the first wave. The commander walked through the trenches, stepping over debris. His uniform was covered in dust, his hands shaking from exhaustion. Yet his voice was steady when he said, "We held the line." Around him, tired faces turned toward the light breaking through the smoke. No one cheered. They were too tired for that. But there was relief, deep, quiet relief. They had faced the storm and hadn't been swept away. The medics moved quickly, helping the injured, while the rest of the soldiers began rebuilding the damaged defenses. They knew this wasn't the end. The enemy would return. But now they also knew something else. They could fight back. Later that morning, as the commander looked out across the valley, he saw one of the Indomitable soldiers sitting on a broken wall, cleaning his weapon calmly. He walked over and asked, "How did you stay so steady out there?" The soldier looked up, his expression calm. "Because I've seen what happens when fear takes over," he said softly. "Once you let fear lead, the battle's already lost." The commander nodded slowly. He understood. Fear was the real enemy, and for the first time in weeks he felt that they had taken something back. Not land, not supplies, but hope. As the sun climbed higher, its light fell on the faces of those who had survived the night. Their eyes were tired, their hands trembling, but there was strength in them again. The quiet returned to the valley, but this time it didn't feel like the silence before disaster. It felt like the pause between chapters, like something new was about to begin. And though they all knew the fight was far from over, the camp no longer felt doomed. The soldiers had faced the impossible and endured. Defeat had seemed certain. Yet somehow, against all odds, they were still there, standing, breathing, and waiting for the next dawn. They had become what everyone whispered about in distant villages, the ones who refused to break. The morning after the first wave was quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. The air was still thick with smoke, and the ground was scattered with broken pieces of metal, burned trees, and the smell of dust. The sun was rising slowly, its pale light cutting through the mist that still hung over the valley. The soldiers knew it was not over. The enemy had only tested their strength last night. The real attack was still coming. Everyone could feel it in the air. It was like standing before a storm. You couldn't see it yet, but you could feel its weight pressing against your chest. The commander walked slowly through the camp. The soldiers greeted him with tired nods. Their uniforms were torn, their faces covered in dirt, but their eyes held something new: determination. They had survived one impossible night. That meant they could survive another. In the middle of the camp, the Indomitable soldiers were already at work. They were checking weapons, fixing defenses, and helping the medics. They never seemed to rest. It was as if they drew their strength not from sleep or food, but from the fire of purpose burning inside them. One of them stood near the front line, tightening a belt on his armor. When someone asked him if he was afraid, he answered simply, "Of course. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward even when you are afraid." Those words spread through the camp like wind passing through leaves. Everyone heard them and everyone understood. By noon, the scouts returned with news no one wanted to hear. The enemy was moving again, this time in large numbers. Tanks, vehicles, and hundreds of soldiers were making their way through the ridge. The message was clear. They were coming to finish what they had started. The commander gathered his people. "We hold the line again," he said. "No one steps back. This is where we stand." The Indomitable soldiers took their positions at the front. They didn't speak much. Their faces were calm, their movements precise. They had been through worse and knew that panic was the first step to defeat. The wind started to pick up again. Dust swirled through the air and the sound of distant engines grew louder. The valley began to tremble under the weight of moving machines. The soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons. Their hearts pounded, but their eyes stayed fixed ahead. Then it began. The first explosion ripped through the silence like a giant, tearing the earth apart. A cloud of smoke rose in the distance, followed by the roar of gunfire. Within moments, the entire valley was alive with chaos. The enemy had arrived. They came in waves, fast, loud, and relentless. Shells exploded near the trenches, throwing mud and shrapnel in every direction. The air filled with the sound of roaring engines and whistling bullets. The defenders ducked low, shouting orders to one another, returning fire whenever they could. The Indomitable soldiers moved like shadows through the smoke. They didn't stay still. They ran from point to point, shouting for others to hold steady, helping those who fell and fixing broken weapons mid-battle. Their calmness under fire gave strength to everyone around them. One of them jumped into a half-collapsed trench where two young soldiers were frozen in fear. "Breathe," he said firmly. "You're not alone." Then he lifted his rifle and started firing with sharp precision. The younger ones followed his lead. That simple moment, 3 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder facing the storm together, became a symbol of the entire defense. Hours passed like minutes. The battle was fierce and unending. Every inch of ground felt like it was being fought for with blood, sweat, and sheer will. The noise was deafening, yet through all of it, the defenders refused to retreat. At one point, an explosion shook the ground so violently that part of the defense line collapsed. Dust and smoke covered everything. The commander, coughing and blinded, thought they had lost that section. But when the air cleared, he saw the Indomitable unit there, still holding, still fighting. Even when communication lines were cut, they adapted. Messages were carried by hand, shouted through the noise, or signaled with flashes of light. No one gave up. Every person became a vital piece of the defense. By late afternoon, the battlefield looked like a storm had torn through it. The ground was torn open, trees were shattered, and the once green valley had turned into a wasteland. Yet in the middle of it all, the defenders stood. They were covered in dirt, sweat, and exhaustion, but they were still there. The enemy, realizing that brute force wasn't breaking them, started pushing harder. The attacks became faster and more desperate. The defenders were running low on ammunition, but not on spirit. In the middle of the chaos, one of the Indomitable soldiers stood atop a damaged vehicle, calling out to the others. His voice rose above the noise, strong and steady. "We've come too far to stop now," he shouted. "They think we'll break. Show them what humans do when they're cornered." Something about those words hit deep. The tired soldiers lifted their heads, reloaded their weapons, and fought with renewed strength. The line, which had started to bend, held firm again. The battle stretched into evening. Smoke covered the sunset, turning the sky a dark shade of orange and gray. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley like thunder. It was impossible to tell who was winning anymore. Both sides had given everything. Then came the turning point. An enemy vehicle broke through one of the outer barriers, heading straight for the main defense. The soldiers nearby were too far to stop it, but one of the Indomitable saw it. Without hesitation, he ran forward. Bullets struck the ground around him, but he didn't slow down. He reached the vehicle and managed to disable it with a well-placed explosive. The blast shook the ground again, but the path was saved. The soldiers watching him cheered, their voices rising even above the explosions. That act of bravery spread like electricity through the ranks. Everyone fought harder, moving as one. By the time the sun disappeared, the battlefield had gone quiet again. The attacks had stopped. The enemy had finally pulled back. For now, the valley belonged to the defenders. When the dust settled, the commander looked around. Many were injured, some too weak to stand, but no one had run. They had done what everyone said was impossible. The indomitable soldiers moved among the others, checking wounds, giving water, and helping rebuild what little could be saved. No one spoke of victory. They all knew the fight wasn't finished yet. But for the first time, it didn't feel like they were losing anymore. As the night grew darker, the commander stood beside the indomitable leader, both staring at the smoking horizon. "We shouldn't have survived that," the commander said quietly. The other man nodded slowly. "Maybe not," he replied. "But sometimes survival isn't luck, it's choice." The commander looked at him and said, "Then we choose again tomorrow." The leader smiled faintly. "We will." Behind them, the soldiers began lighting small fires. The glow spread slowly across the camp, soft and warm against the cold wind. Some sat quietly staring at the flames. Others laughed weakly, trying to shake off the tension of the day. They were exhausted beyond words, but there was something unbreakable in their hearts now. They had seen what true unity looked like. It wasn't about strength or rank. It was about standing together when everything tried to pull you apart. That night, as they lay under the open sky, the sound of distant thunder returned, not from weather, but from the retreating enemy regrouping somewhere beyond the hills. Another attack was certain, yet no one feared it anymore. They had already faced the worst and remained standing. For the first time in weeks, the commander allowed himself to close his eyes. Around him, the camp slowly fell into a tired, uneasy sleep. The wind moved gently through the valley again, carrying with it the faint echo of voices that refused to surrender. Defeat had come close. So close it had nearly swallowed them whole, but the indomitable spirit of human endurance had pushed it back once again. They were battered, bleeding, and exhausted, yet something inside them still burned brighter than the enemy's fire. They had not just survived the battle. They had become the proof that even when everything seems lost, the human heart still knows how to fight. The morning after the second attack came with a strange silence. The valley that had once echoed with explosions and gunfire now lay under a thick blanket of mist. The soldiers moved slowly, their faces pale and eyes heavy. Every step reminded them of what they had lost, but also of what they had managed to protect. The commander stood on a small hill, overlooking the field. The ground was scarred, blackened by fire and dotted with broken machines. It didn't even look like the same place anymore. Yet somehow they were still there, standing, breathing, ready. He knew the peace wouldn't last. The enemy had pulled back, but not for long. They were regrouping, rebuilding, and soon they would come again, stronger and angrier than before. The next battle would decide everything. The indomitable soldiers were already awake before dawn, checking weapons, reinforcing barriers, and setting up traps in silence. They didn't need orders. They knew what had to be done. Their faces were calm, their hands steady, but there was a quiet tension in their eyes. They understood what was coming. The younger soldiers watched them closely, learning without asking questions. Seeing those men and women prepare made them believe survival was still possible. It wasn't their words that inspired, it was their presence. One of the indomitable soldiers walked through the camp carrying a radio with a cracked screen. "We lost connection to command," he said. "No reinforcements. We're on our own." The words hit hard. For a moment, no one spoke. The commander took a slow breath and replied, "Then we fight like we always have, on our own terms." That was the moment something changed in the camp. There was no panic, no despair. Instead, a quiet determination settled over everyone. They began to move faster, speak louder, and help each other with renewed energy. The idea of being alone no longer frightened them. It fueled them. By midday, the sound of engines returned. The ground began to tremble again. Scouts reported enemy movement, bigger than before, stretching as far as the eye could see. Tanks, armored vehicles, and lines of troops were marching toward them like a storm rolling across the horizon. The commander called everyone together one last time. "We have no backup, no air support, no escape route," he said clearly. "What we have is each other, and that's enough. If they want this valley, They'll have to go through us. The soldiers nodded, some smiling faintly. It wasn't bravado, it was acceptance. They knew the odds, and still no one stepped back. The indomitable leader looked around at the soldiers beside him. "Today," he said quietly, "we become the wall." Those words spread fast. Within minutes, whispers turned into shouts. The wall. The human wall. It wasn't a strategy. It was a promise. The sky darkened again as the enemy drew closer. The sound of machines filled the air, mixed with the distant rumble of thunder. Rain began to fall. Not heavy, just enough to make the ground slick and the air colder. The defenders lined up, shoulder to shoulder. Some dug their boots into the mud, others clutched their rifles tightly, but all eyes were fixed forward. Then the first shell hit. The explosion shook the ground. A wave of fire and dirt flew through the air. The enemy had started their final assault. The defenders answered with everything they had. Machine guns rattled, grenades flew, and smoke filled the valley once again. The air smelled of metal and burning oil. The noise was deafening. The enemy kept advancing, their numbers endless. For every one that fell, 2 more took their place. Yet the defenders did not move back. Every inch of ground was fought for like it was sacred. The indomitable soldiers led from the front, moving through the chaos with precision. They repaired broken defenses, pulled the wounded to safety, and shouted encouragement through the roar of battle. One of them climbed onto a burning vehicle to get a better angle and started firing at the incoming line. His voice carried through the smoke, strong, unbroken. "Hold the wall," he shouted. "Don't give them a step." Even when explosions tore holes in the line, people rushed to fill them. The soldiers moved together, covering each other, holding hands when one stumbled, shouting names over the noise to make sure no one was left behind. Hours passed, but the enemy didn't stop. They threw everything they had, waves of troops, drones, armored units, but the line of human soldiers stood firm. Every explosion, every scream, every strike only strengthened their resolve. At one point, the commander himself took a rifle and joined the front. His uniform was torn, his voice hoarse, but his presence alone made others stand taller. "We are the line," he shouted. "We are humanity's answer to defeat." Something remarkable happened then. The tired soldiers, covered in mud and sweat, began to shout together, short, powerful chants that rose above the sound of battle. The valley echoed with human voices, defiant and alive. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a statement. The enemy started to hesitate. Their formations slowed. They had expected fear, retreat, surrender, but what they saw was unity. Real, unbreakable unity. Even as ammunition began to run low, the defenders refused to fall silent. They used what they had left, rocks, broken weapons, anything that could still strike. Some fought hand-to-hand when the line was breached, refusing to give up even when surrounded. The rain grew heavier. The sky flashed with lightning. The battlefield turned into a river of mud and smoke. Yet through it all, the indomitable soldiers kept the defense alive. In the middle of the chaos, one of them noticed something. The enemy vehicles were slowing down. A distant sound, faint at first, grew louder. It was the whine of engines. Not enemy ones this time, but Allied transports. Reinforcements had finally arrived. Someone shouted, "They're coming!" "Our people are coming." The defenders looked up, and for the first time in hours, a cheer broke out. The sound cut through the rain like sunlight breaking through clouds. The incoming forces launched missiles that struck the enemy's flank, scattering their formation. The attackers, realizing they were now trapped between 2 fires, began to fall back. The defenders didn't chase. They stayed where they were, too tired to move, barely able to stand. They had done their part. They had held the line long enough for help to come. When the last explosion faded, the valley was silent once more. Only the rain remained, falling softly over the broken ground. The commander walked through the field, his boots sinking into the mud. The soldiers around him were covered in dirt and blood, but their eyes were alive. They had done the impossible. He stopped beside one of the indomitable soldiers who was sitting on a rock cleaning his weapon. "You said we'd become the wall," the commander said quietly. "You were right." The soldier looked up, his face tired but proud. "A wall doesn't fight to win," he said. "It fights so that others have something left to defend." The commander nodded slowly. "Then we've done what we came to do." The soldier smiled faintly. For now. As the rain began to ease, the survivors gathered together. Some hugged, Others simply stood in silence, staring at the horizon. The sky was clearing, and a faint line of sunlight appeared through the clouds. That small ray of light fell across the faces of those who had fought, the living proof of what courage could achieve when everything seemed lost. The valley would never be the same again. It was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a symbol. The world would one day hear about the soldiers who stood without backup, without escape, and refused to break. They were the proof that strength isn't about weapons or numbers, it's about heart. As the camp settled for the night, the commander wrote a single line in his report. Defeat was unavoidable until the Indomitable took the field. He closed his eyes, listening to the quiet breathing of his soldiers around him, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that humanity still had a chance. The battle was over, but the story of their courage was only beginning. The morning after the final battle came quietly. The valley, which had shaken with fire and thunder for days, now rested under a pale, calm sky. Smoke still drifted from the broken ground, rising in slow curls that disappeared into the cool air. The wind carried a faint smell of ash and rain. The survivors woke slowly. Some opened their eyes in disbelief that they were still alive. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the wreckage around them. It was over, but no one cheered. Victory didn't feel like joy. It felt like relief, heavy and quiet. The commander walked through the camp, his boots crunching over burnt soil. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of what it had cost. The broken walls, the blackened vehicles, the empty helmets lying on the ground. The human wall had held, but at a price that words could barely carry. The medics moved carefully among the wounded. Some soldiers were too weak to speak. Others whispered softly to each other, sharing stories of the battle as if to prove they had really lived through it. The indomitable soldiers, though battered and bruised, refused to rest until everyone had been tended to. They lifted debris, carried the injured, and checked on every single person still breathing. One of them, his arm wrapped in bandages, helped a younger soldier fix a broken radio. "We'll need it to call home," he said. The younger one nodded, his eyes wet but steady. The word home felt strange on his tongue, as if it belonged to another world far away. By midday, the rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, falling gently across the valley. It revealed the full picture. Ruins, yes, but also something remarkable. The flags of the human camp still stood, torn, burned, but not fallen. That small detail stirred something deep inside every survivor who saw it. The commander gathered everyone who could stand. His voice was rough, tired, but filled with pride. "We did what no one believed possible," he said. "We held our ground. We protected each other, and we proved that when everything else fails, the human spirit does not." No one clapped. Instead, they stood in silence, a shared understanding passing between them. It wasn't about victory or medals. It was about survival, about choosing to stand together even when the world tried to break them apart. As the hours passed, they began to rebuild. The camp was cleaned, fires were lit again, and makeshift shelters were set up for the wounded. Some soldiers started planting small flags where their fallen friends had fought. Others placed empty helmets on the ground, marking the spots that would never be forgotten. Later that evening, the commander walked to the edge of the valley. From there, he could see the long line of destroyed enemy vehicles, silent and motionless. It looked like a dark sea frozen in time. The indomitable leader joined him, standing quietly for a while before speaking. "It's strange," he said. "When we came here, this place was just another battleground. Now it feels like the heart of something greater." The commander nodded. "It's the place where defeat ended," he replied softly. For a long time, they stood without words. The wind brushed through the grass, carrying with it the faint echo of voices, shouts, laughter, commands, memories that would never fade. That night, the soldiers gathered around the fires. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. Some shared stories of home, families waiting, towns that still stood, childhood dreams that felt like lifetimes ago. Others simply sat in silence, staring into the flames, lost in thought. One young soldier spoke softly, almost to himself. "I thought we were done for," he said. "But when they said we were the wall, something inside me refused to give up." An older one smiled faintly. "That's what it means to be human," he said. "When the world says you can't, you still try." A ripple of agreement spread through the group. They all felt it, the quiet pride of having been part of something bigger than themselves. In the following days, help finally arrived. New soldiers, engineers, and medical teams flooded the valley. They brought supplies, tents, and fresh food. They stared in awe at the survivors, the ones who had stood against impossible odds and lived to tell the story. Reporters came too, eager to capture the story of the Indomitable defense. Cameras clicked. Interviews were recorded, but most of the soldiers didn't care for fame. They spoke simply, describing what they saw, what they felt, and who they lost. When one reporter asked a soldier how they managed to win, he answered quietly, "We didn't win with strength. We won because we refused to surrender." That quote spread everywhere. It became a message, a symbol of hope for millions who had lost faith in the fight. Across cities and towns, people repeated it, whispered it to each other when fear returned. Humanity had been on the edge of collapse, but now it had a story to hold on to. As the valley was cleared, the commander walked through the remains of the battlefield one last time. He touched the burnt soil, the torn metal, the scattered helmets. Every mark told a story. Every scar carried meaning. He turned to the Indomitable leader and said, "We'll rebuild, but we'll never forget this place." The leader nodded. "We shouldn't. The world needs to remember that courage isn't born in comfort, it's built in fire." Days turned into weeks. The soldiers were finally allowed to rest. Some were sent home, others stayed to help rebuild nearby towns. The Indomitable unit was honored quietly without grand ceremonies. They didn't want fame. What they wanted was peace, and the chance to live in a world that understood the cost of it. The commander eventually returned to the capital. When he entered the Hall of Records to file his report, the clerks expected pages of tactical data, coordinates, and losses. Instead, he handed them a single sheet of paper. On it were just a few words. Defeat was unavoidable until they stood. That line became part of history. Years later, when children asked their parents about the war, they would hear the story of the valley, the place where ordinary humans stood shoulder to shoulder and became a wall that refused to fall. The world changed after that. Nations that once fought over borders began working together to rebuild. The lessons learned in that valley spread like roots through the soil of every surviving land. Monuments were built, not of stone, but of metal salvaged from the battlefield. Each piece carried the marks of fire and shrapnel, a reminder that beauty can be found even in destruction. At the center of the memorial stood a single statue, a soldier without a weapon, standing tall, hand extended as if reaching for something beyond the sky. The inscription below read, "Here stood those who would not break. Here stood humanity." Every year, people came from across the world to stand before that statue. Some brought flowers, others brought silence. No one left unchanged. Among those who visited was the commander himself, now older, his hair streaked with gray. He stood before the statue and whispered, "We made it." He could almost hear the echoes of that long-ago battle. The shouting, the rain, the heartbeat of 1,000 people who refused to fall. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he could see them all again, the human wall, standing in the mud, defying defeat. The war had taken much, but it had also revealed something unshakable, the soul of humanity. Even in ruin, there had been light. Even in despair, there had been courage. And even when defeat had seemed certain, human hearts had chosen to rise again. As the sun set behind the monument, its golden light fell across the engraved words, making them glow softly. The world was quiet now, but the memory of that stand, the defiance, the unity, the hope, still burned brighter than ever. Because some battles are not just about survival. They are about proving who we are. And that day, on that broken field, humanity had proved that no matter how dark the world becomes, there will always be those who choose to stand and fight for the light.